Hey folks, my name is Mo Amir and this is VANCOLOUR, British Columbia's bona fide culture and politics TV talk show. Tonight, are you a fan of stand-up comedy? Well, it seems like a lot of cultural conversations are being framed around stand-up comedy, and as a result, there seems to be a lot of controversy in comedy, and Canadian comics are not immune from this. So let's talk about the differences between intent and impact. Let's talk about accountability, and let's talk about freedom of expression as it applies to folks whose job it is to make you laugh. Our first guest tonight is a Cree Métis stand-up comedian by the way of Winnipeg. You've seen them at Just for Laughs Vancouver, an absolute mega talent and a faculty member of Blind Tiger Comedy. You may also have seen him as a panelist for APTN. Currently, he's featured on the new comedy docuseries YVR Funny, which earlier this month premiered on Telus Optik TV on demand. He is Sasha Mark. Sasha, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Oh, thank you for having me. I wish we had like a cooler circumstance of like hanging out, but this is real serious.
We'll have you back at a cooler time. I do want your insights into this. I feel like anytime a public figure makes a controversial statement, they always defend themselves saying, hey, you know what? My intent was actually different. And yet their critics say, well, the impact was harmful. And an unfortunate example of this is local comic Sophie Buttle. She's been blowing up. She's done some late night television as well. She's been a guest on this show. And she released her Crave special, her stand-up special called Smile Baby. And it had a joke where her intent was to point out the hypocrisy of the Catholic Church. And she was saying, you know, on one hand, they're really against reproductive rights, they're anti-abortion. And on the other hand, they do have a history of facilitating some really horrific things, particularly residential schools in this country, in Canada. And a lot of people looked at that joke and they said, well, regardless of your intent, you use this very painful experience from survivors, families, communities, and you use this as a prop for a punchline. So I want to get your take on it. What did you think when you saw the joke? And what did you think when you saw sort of the outrage that emerged from it?
When these sorts of things happen, it falls a lot of pressure falls on a lot of like Indigenous artists to really speak up and to be the voices for whole communities. So my community, my voice can't, like, I'm one voice. I can't represent all the nation's voices. People have different opinions and different thoughts.
And I do appreciate
it's a big responsibility.
I appreciate your emotional labor in being able to talk about this as well. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to get paid so much money, right?
We'll talk after.
But no, I think for me, when it comes to intention versus impact, your intentions don't matter first. We need to focus on the impact of what happened. So with a joke like that, we saw a lot of Indigenous folks really hurt by this commentary and this comedy. And a lot of voices really voiced up saying, your joke was harmful. At the end of the day, dead Indigenous children are not a punchline. Secondarily as well, when we talk about impact versus intention, we need to think about, what does that even mean? Mm-hmm. So, for example, my intentions could be good. Say I'm a dad. Mm-hmm. I'm a dad, and I really want my kids to grow up very smart, do well in school. Sure. I want them to be well behaved. I want them to be successful. And and by doing that, I really lead as a parent as being strict. I really lead as being a parent that is very into like monitoring the children, very and also like too involved and very invasive parent. So then what happens with the kids? The impact is that these kids get a distant relationship from their parents. You know, like sometimes the impact is these kids are a little closed off from these parents. Part of that impact is that they're no longer close with these parents when they get older. Mm-hmm. So these are the impacts. It doesn't matter what the parents' intentions were. The impact happened to the kid and it damaged the relationship. Mm-hmm. So we need to think about how the impact impact comes first. Impact comes first. Yeah. Intentions we can always deal with later. It is important to recognize too, as well as like, if I, threw a football in your face by accident, my intention wasn't to do that. I'm so sorry. Right. But if I did it on purpose, I'm a butthole. I'm not nice. I'm not nice. Sure. So if I do it on purpose, you're probably going to be like, I'm not going to be his friend anymore. Done. Yeah. But if I do that too many times to you by accident, you're going to be
I'll start to be suspicious.
100%.
Yeah.
You'll start to be suspicious. So that's what happens when people do wrongdoings over and over and over again, whether their intentions are good or not. People tend to like draw back from folks who keep impacting folks.
Right. So basically what you're saying is, we do all have a responsibility to be more thoughtful in what we say and in what we do. I guess, is the problem that because comedy historically has been about walking the line of what's acceptable and what's not, delving into the taboo, pushing the envelope, the lines are not clearly drawn in terms of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so a comedian might be thinking, like perhaps Sophie, that, hey, I have this edgy joke that points out the hypocrisy of this very powerful institution without considering, the harm that it might be doing in terms of how she set up the joke.
Yeah, and for sure, like the line is the art of comedy, baby. It's, but it is, and that line changes all the time. As a comedian, it's our job to sometimes step on that line, maybe step behind that line, to step over that line. Some people snort some lines. I don't know if that's appropriate, so you can edit that out. But yeah. So that line moves. I would say, though, it's our job when we get a lot of feedback that we really hurt a community, is to really take that in and to turn that issue that you wronged folks in and to turn it around and make it right again.
Absolutely.
That's the responsibility.
So then really quick, when we talk about things like accountability, like I'm not really in favor of fully canceling Sophie Buttle over a single joke. I do think that, we should all reflect on this incident. But when you have a situation like this where a comedian does cross the line and there are communities that are hurt, what does accountability look like?
Accountability looks different, on a case-by-case basis. I agree with your sentiments. Partially, I agree with your sentiments. I think that when we think of cancel culture, I'm not always team cancel culture. I always think of it as a colonial and capitalist kind of tool in some ways. The idea of cancel culture is that we dispose people rather than fixing the issue.
Right.
So that's a part of it. And that's, if we look at Indigenous protocols, like banishment's usually one of our last forms of protocol,
right.
Where, historically it's our first form. But secondly, like cancel culture exists as well to keep people safe. So when a marginalized group or a community of artists, and there's one person who's like assaulting a group of artists, the easiest way to create space and distance from that person is by quote unquote canceling them and removing them from those spaces and not letting them allowed into them, so they no longer continue that harm. When it comes to accountability, though, I think at the end of the day, it's about acknowledging the hurt and sincerely being accountable to it. Part of doing stand-up is apologizing. I know that historically, famous comedians were like, I will never apologize for a joke. And I think that's something that was like stuck with the 90s. And then when we look back at that comedy, we are like, oh, gross.
Yeah.
But when it comes to, for example, my first job, I worked at an ice cream place, I know when I go up to that job, I'm going to be serving ice cream. I'm going to be handing out ice cream cones throughout my whole day. I know that's part of my job. Part as a comedian is that we're walking on this line, and there's going to be times where we hurt people's feelings, and we need to like validate that they're hurt, and we need to listen to them, and we also need to apologize and meaningfully apologize. Because that's part of our job. If you don't know how to apologize, maybe you shouldn't be in a field where we're walking the line all the time.
Absolutely. Well, hey, Sasha, I appreciate your time tonight. I appreciate your thoughtful insights. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Mo.
Absolutely. Folks, find him on the new comedy docuseries YVR Funny, which just premiered on Telus Optik TV on demand earlier this month. He is, of course, Sasha Mark. Now, after some business, we're going to add another layer of dialogue to the conversation as VANCOLOUR fan favorite Dino Archie will join us up next. I'm Mo Amir. This is VANCOLOUR.